The twin moons of Erner cast an eerie glow over the city of Solera, its towering spires and elegant arches bathing in the soft silver light. The streets were quiet, save for the faint rustling of the wind through the iridescent leaves of the Weiner. There is so lame of the wind through the iridescent leaves of the tall trees that lined the avenues. It was a night like any other on Arendar, where order reigned supreme, and the stars themselves seemed to bow to the iron will of tradition. But within the heart of this tranquil city, in a small, dimly lit room, a storm was brewing. Lila stood before her reflection, her violet eyes sharp and unwavering as they met her own gaze in the mirror. She was dressed in the traditional robes of her people, a flowing garment of deep indigo that clung to her lithe frame. The fabric shimmered with the faintest trace of bioluminescence, a feature unique to Arendar's finest silks. But Lila felt no pride in the craftsmanship that her people so revered. To her, it was merely another symbol of the stifling traditions that suffocated her. Her fingers traced the intricate patterns woven into the fabric, her mind far from the ceremonial beauty of her attire. She was thinking of the Council of Elders, the ancient, all-powerful body that dictated every aspect of Arendarian life. It was they who enforced the rules that had kept their society isolated from the rest of the galaxy, who decreed that relationships with humans were an abomination, a threat to the purity of their species. It was they who had turned a blind eye to the injustices that festered beneath the surface of their perfect world. Lila's resentment had begun to simmer in her childhood, sparked by the whispered stories of those who had dared to defy the Fithers and paid the price. She had heard of the outcasts, those who had been banished for forming bonds with humans, cast into the unforgiving wastelands beyond the city walls. Her parents had warned her to heed the laws, to never question the ways of their people. But Lila had never been one to obey without question. Her mind drifted back to the day she had first realized the depth of her hatred for her society. She had been no more than 15 cycles old, standing in the Grand Plaza of Solera, watching as a young woman was dragged before the council. The woman had been accused of fraternizing with a human traitor who had visited Arendar, and the punishment was swift and merciless. Lila had watched in horror as the woman was stripped of her name, her identity, and her very essence, left as nothing more than a hollow shell before being cast out into the wilds. The sight had seared itself into Lila's memory, a stark reminder of the cruelty that lay beneath the polished veneer of their civilization. From that day forward, Lila's resentment had only grown. She had seen the hypocrisy of her people, the way they preached purity and superiority while turning a blind eye to the corruption that seeped through the cracks of their society. She had witnessed the suffering of those who were different, those who dared to think for themselves. And with each injustice, her resolve had hardened. Now, as she stood in her room, the soft hum of the city outside her window, Lila knew that the time had come to act. She would no longer be a passive observer, content to seethe in silence. She would strike back at the society that had caused her so much pain, and she would do so in the most profound way possible. Her plan was simple in its audacity. She would seek out human men, those whom her people had deemed unworthy, and she would form relationships with them. But these would not be bonds of love or affection. No, Lila had no room in her heart for such sentiments. Her relationships would be acts of rebellion, of defiance, and of revenge. She would taint the purity that her people so valued, not with hate, but with calculated indifference. She would show them that their rules, their traditions, were nothing more than a fragile facade. As Lila contemplated her plan, a cold determination settled over her. She knew the risks. If she were caught, she would face the same fate as the woman she had seen all those years ago. But the thought did not frighten her. On the contrary, it exhilarated her. She had lived her entire life under the suffocating weight of Ender's traditions, and now, for the first time, she felt truly free. With a final glance at her reflection, Lila turned away from the mirror and strode towards the door. The time for reflection was over. It was time to act. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Lila felt a thrill of anticipation surge through her. The streets of Solera were deserted, the city at peace in the deep hours of the night. But Lila's mind was far from peaceful. She knew where she needed to go, the place where the human traders often gathered when they visited Arendar. It was a seedy district on the outskirts of the city, a place shunned by most of her kind. But for Lila, it was the perfect hunting ground. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way through the winding streets, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never ventured into this part of the city before, but she felt no hesitation. She was driven by a purpose far greater than herself, a desire to strike back at the society that had wronged her. As she approached the district, the atmosphere changed. The polished elegance of Solera gave way to something darker, more primal. The buildings were smaller, more crowded, their facades worn and faded. The air was thick with the scent of spices and something else, something more exotic, more forbidden. Lila's senses were on high alert as she entered the heart of the district, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. She did not have to wait long. In the distance, she saw them humans. A group of men, their laughter rough and boisterous, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet order of Arendor. They were gathered outside a dimly lit tavern, their faces flushed with drink and merriment. Leela felt a thrill of anticipation as she watched them, her mind already calculating her next move. She approached them with a confidence she did not truly feel, her steps deliberate and measured. As she drew closer, the men noticed her, their laughter fading as they turned to face her. Lila could feel their eyes on her, taking in her eyes all appearance, her shimmering robes, her sake. She was an alien to them, a creature of mystery and allure. "Well, what do we have here?" one of the men drawled, his voice slurred with drink. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a roughness to his features that spoke of a life lived on the fringes of society. The others murmured in agreement, their gazes lingering on her with a mix of curiosity and something darker. Lila did not flinch under their scrutiny. Instead, she met their gaze with a cold detachment, her voice steady as she spoke. "I seek the company of humans," she said, her words carefully chosen, devoid of emotion. "Is that something you can provide?" The men exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to intrigue. They were not used to being approached in such a manner, especially not by one of her kind. Lila could see the questions forming in their minds, but she did not give them the chance to ask. "I am not here for pleasantries," she continued, her voice firm. "I have my reasons, and I do not wish to explain them. If you are willing to accommodate me, I will make it worth your while." The leader of the group, the tall man with the rough features, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Leela could see the suspicion in his gaze, the doubt that flickered behind his eyes. But she also saw something else, greed, and perhaps a touch of desire. He was weighing the risks, considering the possibilities. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "All right," he said, his voice low, "we can accommodate you. But know this, if you're playing us, there will be consequences." Leela felt a cold smile curl at the corners of her lips. "I assure you," she said softly, "I am not one to be trifled with." The man hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded again, signaling to the others. "Follow us," he said, turning towards the entrance of the tavern. Lila followed them without a word, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, that she was playing a game with stakes higher than any she had ever known. But that was precisely why she was doing it. She wanted to feel the thrill, the rush of adrenaline that came with defying everything she had ever been taught. As they entered the tavern, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors, Lila knew there was no turning back. She had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. But she felt no regret, no fear, only a cold, calculated determination. For Leela, this was not just an act of rebellion. It was a declaration of war, and she intended to win. The journey to Earth was unlike anything Lila had ever experienced. Arendor's sleek starships, with their polished silver exteriors and silent, gravity-defying engines, were a far cry from the rugged, weathered human vessels she encountered in the bustling spaceports. The voyage itself was an adventure, a stark contrast to the regimented life she had known on her home planet. Each star she passed, each galaxy she crossed, felt like a step further from the chains that had bound her, and closer to the freedom she had always craved. Earth had always been a forbidden topic on Arendor, a place spoken of only in hushed tones and with a hint of disdain. It was a planet of contrasts, of towering cities and wild landscapes, of innovation and decay, of passion and brutality. But to Leela, Earth represented something much more profound. It was a symbol of everything her people feared and rejected, and therefore it was precisely where she needed to be. As her ship descended through the atmosphere, Lila peered out of the small viewport, her eyes wide with anticipation. The sprawling city of New York came into view, its jagged skyline piercing the clouds, illuminated by countless lights that flickered like stars in the darkness. The city was alive, pulsing with energy, a stark contrast to the serene, ordered landscapes of Arendor. When Leela stepped off the ship and onto Earth's soil for the first time, she felt a surge of exhilaration. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents, the sounds of the city, a cacophony of life that overwhelmed her senses. But rather than feeling lost or out of place, Leela felt a strange sense of belonging. This was a world where chaos thrived, where rules were bent and broken, and where passion was not just allowed but celebrated. It was exactly where she wanted to be. Leela wasted no time in immersing herself in Earth's culture. She was a quick study, adapting to the planet's customs with ease, her sharp intellect and natural charm allowing her to blend in effortlessly. She found herself fascinated by the humans she encountered, their openness, their creativity, and most of all, their capacity for emotion. Unlike the calculated, sterile interactions she had known on Arendor, human relationships were messy, unpredictable, and wonderfully intense. Her first encounters with human men were tentative, exploratory. She was cautious not because she feared them, but because she was still grappling with the novelty of it all. But as she grew more comfortable, she began to embrace the full scope of her desires. Lila's beauty was otherworldly, her violet eyes and luminescent skin drawing attention wherever she went. But it was more than just her appearance that captivated those around her. There was something about her aura, an intoxicating mix of mystery, confidence, and defiance that made her irresistible. The men she encountered were drawn to her like moths to a flame, unaware that they were becoming unwitting participants in her silent rebellion. But for Lila, these relationships quickly evolved beyond mere acts of defiance. With each connection, she discovered something new about them, and about herself. Her first lover was a writer, a man with dark eyes and a soul full of poetry. He saw in Lila a muse, a figure of inspiration that reignited his passion for his craft. Their nights were filled with whispered verses and lingering touches, and for the first time, Lila experienced the power of words, the way they could weave connections as strong as any physical bond. She was moved by his vulnerability, by the way he laid bare his soul in his writings, and she found herself doing the same, sharing pieces of herself. The next was a musician, a man with calloused fingers and a voice that could break your heart. With him, Lila discovered the raw, unfiltered power of music, the way it could convey emotions too complex for words, the way it could heal and hurt at the same time. They spent hours together, lost in the melodies they created, their bodies moving to the rhythm of their shared passion. It was through him that Lila began to understand the true meaning of connection, not just as a tool for rebellion, but as something profound, something that could change her in ways she had never imagined. And then there was the painter, a man with a wild imagination and an insatiable curiosity. He saw Lila not as an alien, but as a canvas, a subject to be explored and understood. He painted her in all her forms, in the soft glow of morning light, in the deep shadows of midnight, in the vibrant colors of her anger, and the muted tones of her sorrow. Through his art, Lila began to see herself in a new light, to appreciate the beauty in her complexity, to embrace the emotion she had always been taught to suppress. Each relationship was a revelation, a step further away from the cold, calculated world of Erender, and deeper into the warmth and chaos of human emotion. Lila found herself drawn to these men not just for their differences, but for their humanity, for the way they lived, loved and lost with such unbridled passion. They were teaching her to feel, to connect in ways she had never known were possible. And in turn, she was teaching them about a world beyond their understanding, a world that was slowly but surely losing its hold on her. But as Lila's connections with these men deepened, so too did the consequences of her actions. News of her defiance spread quickly back to Erender, carried on the wings of rumor and speculation. Her people were horrified, their strict societal norms shaken by the boldness of her rebellion. The Council of Elders convened in secret, their discussions heavy with anger and fear. They had always known that Lila was different, that her spirit was too wild to be easily contained, but they had never anticipated that she would go this far. The uproar in Solera was palpable. Lila's name became a symbol of defiance, her actions a rallying cry for those who had long chafed under the weight of tradition. But for the majority of Endertor's population, she was a traitor, a light on the pure Prizanste, a blight on the purity they held so dear. They called for her capture, her punishment, her eradication. But Lila was beyond their reach, lost in the depths of Earth's sprawling cities, hidden by the very chaos they despise. Despite the growing storm on her home planet, Lila remained unafraid. She had tasted freedom, and she had no intention of giving it up. The relationships she had formed were no longer just acts of rebellion. They had become a part of her identity, a declaration of who she was and who she wanted to be. Each human lover was a step further away from the chains of Erender, and closer to the person she had always been meant to become. Lila reveled in the chaos she had caused both on Earth and on Erender. She had found power in her defiance, a power that was intoxicating and liberating in equal measure. For the first time in her life, she was in control of her destiny, of her emotions, and she was determined to hold on to that control, no matter the cost. As she stood on the balcony of her apartment, overlooking the shimmering lights of the city below, Lila felt a sense of peace settle over her. The night was warm, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers and distant rain. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the city wash over her, feeling the pulse of life that coursed through the streets. She was no longer the girl from Erender, bound by tradition and fear. She was Lila, a woman who had forged her own path, who had chosen her own fate. And as long as there were stars in the sky and love in her heart, she would continue to defy the world that had tried to break her. For Lila, the rebellion was far from over. It had only just begun. Lila had never imagined that a man like Steve would enter her life. She had spent so long cultivating her rebellion, defining herself by her defiance against Irindorthar's rigid society, that she had grown accustomed to seeing men as mere tools in her grand act of resistance. Human men, with their curious, often simplistic ways, were easy to manipulate, easy to keep at a distance. She was in control always. But Steve was different. From the moment they met, Lila had sensed something unusual about him. It wasn't just his sharp intellect or his genuine curiosity about her world, it was the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to see beyond her carefully constructed defenses. There was a gentleness in his gaze, a depth of understanding that unnerved her even as it drew her in. He didn't want to possess her or change her. He wanted to know her, to share in her journey, whatever that might be. Their relationship began like all of Lila's others, intense, passionate, and tinged with the thrill of the forbidden. They spent hours together, exploring the city, discussing everything from the complexities of interspecies relations to the subtleties of human art and music. Steve was fascinated by Lila's stories of Irindor, by the culture that had shaped her, and the anger that had driven her to leave it all behind. He listened with a patience and empathy that Lila had never encountered before, allowing her to express the full range of her emotions without fear of judgment or reprisal. At first, Lila was cautious. She was used to controlling the pace of her relationships, to keeping men at arm's length, never allowing them to get too close. But Steve was different. He didn't push her for more than she was willing to give. He didn't try to force his way into her heart. Instead, he let her come to him on her own terms, allowing her to set the boundaries, to dictate the course of their connection. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Lila began to let her guard down. It started with small things: a shared laugh over a particularly witty comment, a quiet moment of reflection as they watched the sunset over the city skyline, a lingering touch that sent a thrill of warmth through her body. Steve's presence was calming, reassuring, like a steady anchor in the midst of the storm that had defined Lila's life for so long. He didn't demand anything from her. He simply offered her the space to be herself, to explore her own desires and emotions without fear of rejection or condemnation. For the first time in her life, Lila found herself wanting more than just a fleeting connection. She wanted something real, something lasting. The thought terrified her, shaking the very foundations of her carefully constructed identity. She had always defined herself by her rebellion, by her refusal to be bound by the expectations of her people or the desires of the men she encountered. But with Steve, things were different. She didn't feel the need to rebel against him. Instead, she found herself drawn to the possibility of building something new, something that wasn't defined by anger or defiance. As the weeks turned into months, Lila and Steve's relationship deepened. They spent more and more time together, their connection growing stronger with each passing day. Steve introduced Lila to his world, showing her the beauty and complexity of Earth in ways she had never imagined. They visited museums, attended concerts, and explored the natural wonders of the planet. Lila was fascinated by the diversity of human culture, by the endless variety of experiences and perspectives that made Earth so different from Irindor. But it wasn't just the external experiences that drew Lila in, it was the way Steve made her feel. He treated her with a respect and gentleness she had never known, always careful to honor her boundaries and listen to her needs. He never tried to control her or make her conform to his expectations. Instead, he celebrated her uniqueness, encouraging her to embrace her own path, whatever that might be. For Lila, this was a revelation. She had spent so long fighting against the expectations of others, against the rigid norms of her society, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be herself. With Steve, she didn't have to fight. She could just be. One evening, as they sat together on Steve's apartment balcony, the city lights twinkling below them, Lila found herself contemplating the future in a way she never had before. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and distant rain, and a sense of peace settled over her as she leaned against Steve, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. Steve began, her voice soft. Have you ever thought about what the future might hold for us? Steve looked down at her, his blue eyes reflecting the lights of the city below. I think about it all the time, Ten admitted, his voice gentle. But I don't want to push you into anything you dang not ready for. Lila, I know how important your freedom is to you, and I would never want to take that away. Lila felt a surge of warmth at his words, a deep sense of gratitude for the way Steve always put her needs first. I know, she said, turning to face him. But I think I'm ready to start thinking about what comes next. For us? Steve smiled, his expression filled with a mixture of hope and love. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together, he said, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her forehead. I'm in this for the long haul, Lila. Whatever path you choose, I'll be right there with you. Lila closed her eyes, savoring the feeling of Steve's lips against her skin, the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in her life, she felt truly safe, truly loved. It was a feeling she had never expected to find, a feeling that filled her with a sense of peace and contentment she had never known. But even as she allowed herself to relax into Steve's embrace, a part of her remained wary. She knew that her past, her rebellion, was not something she could simply leave behind. There were still unresolved issues, still questions that needed to be answered, still battles that needed to be fought. And she knew that as much as she wanted to embrace this new life with Steve, she couldn't do so without first confronting the demons of her past. As the weeks passed, Lila found herself growing more and more introspective, contemplating the choices she had made and the paths she had taken to get to this point. She thought about her rebellion, about the anger and pain that had driven her to leave Erindur and seek out human men as a way of striking back at her people. She thought about the relationships she had formed, the connections she had made, and the ways in which they had shaped her. But most of all, she thought about Steve. Steve had shown her a different way of living, a way that didn't require her to constantly fight against the expectations of others. He had shown her that it was possible to be strong and independent without being consumed by anger or defiance. He had shown her that love didn't have to be a battlefield, that it could be a source of strength and support, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. And as Lila considered all of this, she realized that she was ready to take the next step. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Steve working on his latest research project and Lila lost in thought, she turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Steve," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I had been thinking a lot lately. About us, about the future." Steve looked up from his work, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's on your mind, Lila?" Lila took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I know that we have talked about the future before, and I know that you've always been patient with me, never pushing me to make a decision before I am ready. But I think I am ready now. Steve's eyes widened slightly, a look of surprise and hope crossing his face. "Ready for what?" Lila smiled, reaching out to take his hand in hers. Ready to build a life with you, a real life. I don't want to keep running from my past, from the things that have shaped me, but I also don't want to be defined by them anymore. I want to move forward with you." Steve's expression softened and he squeezed her hand gently. "Lila, you have no idea how much that means to me. I've always known that you've been carrying a lot of pain, a lot of anger, and I've never wanted to add to that. But I'm so glad to hear that you dare ready to start thinking about the future, about us." Lila nodded, her heart swelling with love for the man sitting before her. "I am. I really am. But there's something else I need to tell you, something that's been weighing on me." Steve's expression grew more serious and he leaned in slightly, his gaze focused on her. "What is it, Lila? You can tell me anything." Lila took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Steve, I want you to know that I am not perfect. I've made a lot of mistakes, done things that I'm not proud of, and I know that I'd a multiple away, even if it wasn't intentional, but I don't want to live in the shadow of those mistakes anymore. I want to learn from them, to grow from them. And I want to do that with you." Steve's eyes softened and he reached out to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing against her skin. "Lila, I don't expect you to be perfect. I never have. We all have our pasts, our mistakes, our regrets. But what matters is that you are willing to learn from them, to grow, to become the person you want to be. And I want to be there with you every step of the way." Lila felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she leaned into Steve's touch, her heart overflowing with love for the man who had become her anchor in the storm. "Then thank you, Steve. Thank you for understanding, for always being there for me." Steve smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. "Always, Lila. Always." In the weeks that followed, Lila and Steve began to plan their future together in earnest. They talked about where they wanted to live, the kind of life they wanted to build, and the dreams they had for the years to come. Lila found herself opening up to Steve in ways she had never done with anyone before, sharing her deepest fears, her greatest hopes, and the pain that had shaped her. And through it all, Steve remained by her side, offering his unwavering support and love. He never judged her for her past, never tried to change her or make her conform to his expectations. Instead, he encouraged her to be true to herself, to embrace her identity and her journey, and to trust in the strength of their connection. As their relationship deepened, Lila found herself growing more and more comfortable with the idea of a future with Steve. She no longer felt the need to rebel against the world, to prove herself through acts of defiance. Instead, she found strength in the love she and Steve shared, in the partnership they were building together. One day, as they were walking through Central Park, the sun shining brightly overhead, Steve turned to Lila, his expression serious. "And Lila," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "I know we've all talked about the future, about building a life together. And I want you to know that I'm ready to take the next step whenever you are." Lila looked up at him, her heart swelling with love for the man who had become her everything. "I am ready, Steve," he said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "I am ready to take that step with you." Steve smiled, his eyes shining with happiness. "Lila, will you marry me?" Lila felt her heart skip a beat, and she knew without a doubt that this was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the future she had been searching for, the life she had been fighting for. And she was ready to embrace it, with Steve by her side. "Yes, Steve," she said, her voice filled with love and certainty. "Yes, I will marry you, and Tio." Steve's smile widened, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as they both absorbed the absurdity of what they had just agreed to. For Lila, this was more than just a commitment to another person. It was a commitment to herself, to the new life she was building, to the person she was becoming. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair held in a quiet garden on the outskirts of the city. There were no grand ceremonies, no elaborate traditions, just Lila and Steve, surrounded by a handful of close friends, pledging their lives to one another. Lila wore a simple white dress, her violet eyes shining with emotion as she looked into Steve's eyes and spoke the words that bound them together. As they exchanged vows, Lila felt a sense of peace she had never known before. This was not a rebellion, not a defiance, it was an acceptance, a choice to build something new, something real. And as she stood there holding Steve's hands, she knew that she had made the right choice. But even as they began their life together, Lila knew that the challenges were far from over. She still carried the weight of her past, the pain of her rebellion, the unresolved issues that had driven her to leave Arendor in the first place. And she knew that at some point she would have to confront those demons, to face the consequences of her actions and find a way to make peace with herself. But for now, Lila allowed herself to be happy, to embrace the love and support that Steve offered her, to build the life she had always dreamed of. She knew that the future was uncertain, that there would be obstacles and challenges ahead, but she also knew that she wasn't alone, that she had someone by her side who loved her, who believed in her, who was willing to fight for her. And with that knowledge, Lila felt a sense of hope and possibility that she had never known before. The path ahead was uncharted, the future uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Lila was ready to face it, to embrace it, to make it her own. With Steve by her side, Lila knew that she could conquer anything, that she could build the life she had always dreamed of, that she could find the peace and happiness she had imagined. And as they stood together, hand in hand, looking out at the world they were about to build, Lila knew that the best was yet to come. Weeks had passed since Lila and Steve had exchanged vows in the quiet garden surrounded by the warmth of their closest friends. The simplicity of their ceremony had been a testament to the purity of their love, a love that transcended the boundaries of species, culture, and tradition. Yet, beneath the surface of their newfound happiness, Lila could feel the echoes of her past reverberating through her mind, reminding her that the journey was far from over. Life with Steve had been everything Lila had hoped for and more. Their days were filled with shared moments of joy, laughter, and quiet contentment. They had settled into a rhythm, a comfortable routine that was punctuated by spontaneous adventures and late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Steve continued his work as a scientist, delving into the complexities of interspecies relations, while Lila found herself drawn to new interests: art, literature, and even gardening, a hobby she had never imagined herself enjoying. But despite the peace and happiness that enveloped their lives, Lila could not shake the feeling that something was missing. There was a restlessness within her, a yearning for something more, something that she couldn't quite put into words. It was as if a part of her was still searching, still reaching for the fulfillment that had eluded her for so long. It was during one of these quiet moments of introspection that Lila found herself contemplating the idea of motherhood. On Arendor, reproduction had been a controlled, clinical process, devoid of the intimacy and emotion that seemed to characterize human relationships. The thought of bringing new life into the world had never appealed to her. It had always felt like just another way for the elders to exert control over their people. But here on Earth, with Steve by her side, the idea took on a different meaning. It wasn't about fulfilling a societal expectation or adhering to a rigid tradition. It was about love, about the possibility of creating something beautiful and unique, something that was a part of both her and Steve. The thought intrigued her, filled her with a sense of wonder and excitement that she had never known before. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Steve's arm wrapped around her shoulders, Lila turned to him, her violet eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Steve, she began, her voice soft but steady. Ty been thinking about something important. Steve looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the warmth of the dimly lit room. But what is it, Lila? You know you can talk to me about anything. Leela hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts before speaking. Ty been thinking about having a child. I know it is not something we've really talked about, but I've been wondering what it would be like to try to experience the human reproductive process, to create life together. Steve's expression softened, a look of understanding and love crossing his face. Lila, that is a big decision, and it is something that we should definitely talk about. But if that is something you want, if that is something you feel ready for, then I am with you every step of the way. Lila felt a surge of emotion at his words, a deep sense of gratitude for the way Steve always supported her, always made her feel valued and respected. I am ready, Steve. Steve said, her voice filled with conviction. I had spent so much of my life fighting against the idea of being controlled, of being forced into a role I didn't choose. But this would be my choice, our choice. It would be about creating something beautiful together, something that's a part of both of us. Steve smiled, his eyes shining with love. Then let us do it, Lila. Let's take this step together. Their first kiss was slow, tender, a gentle exploration of the love they shared. Lila felt the warmth of Steve's lips against hers, the steady rhythm of his breath mingling with her own. It was a kiss filled with promise, with the unspoken understanding that this was the beginning of something profound and life-changing. As their kisses deepened, so too did the connection between them. Steve's hands slid down her body, tracing the curves of her figure with a reverence that made Lila's heart ache with love. She responded in kind, her hands exploring the familiar contours of his chest, his shoulders, the strength of his. When they finally moved to the room, it was with a sense of reverence, as if they were embarking on a sacred journey together. They slowly, savoring the anticipation, the knowledge that they were about to create something beautiful and new. Steve's hands were gentle as they moved over her skin, his touch igniting a fire within her that burned with a deep, all-consuming need. Leela had always been in control, always the one who dictated the pace of her relationships. But with Steve, it was different. She trusted him completely, allowing herself to be vulnerable, to surrender to the moment, knowing that he would take care of her, that he would honor the love they shared. When they finally came together, it was as if the world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them, joined in the most intimate way possible. Lila felt a deep connection to Steve in that moment, a sense of unity that transcended the physical, reaching into the very core of who they were. Their movements were slow and deliberate, a dance of love and trust that built steadily toward a crescendo. Lila felt the world tilt beneath her as they moved together, her senses overwhelmed by the intensity of the emotions that flooded through her. It was as if every nerve in her body was alive with sensation, every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of love magnified 1,000-fold. As they reached the peak of their union, Leela felt a rush of warmth and love that seemed to fill her entire being. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, a moment that left her breathless and trembling in Steve's arms. She held onto him tightly, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her own, knowing that they had created something beautiful together, something that would change their lives forever. Afterward, they lay together in the soft glow of the afternoon light, their bodies entwined, their hearts still racing with the aftershocks of their union. Lila felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, a sense of contentment that she had never known before. She turned her head to look at Steve, her violet eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Then thank you, Will," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Weeks had passed since Leela and Steve had exchanged vows in the quiet garden surrounded by the warmth of their closest friends. The simplicity of their ceremony had been a testament to the purity of their love, a love that transcended the boundaries of species, culture, and tradition. Yet, beneath the surface of their newfound happiness, Lila could feel the echoes of her past reverberating through her mind, reminding her that the journey was far from over. Life with Steve had been everything Lila had hoped for and more. Their days were filled with shared moments of joy, laughter, and quiet contentment. They had settled into a rhythm, a comfortable routine that was punctuated by spontaneous adventures and late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Steve continued his work as a scientist, delving into the complexities of interspecies relations, while Leela found herself drawn to new interests: art, literature, and even gardening, a hobby she had never imagined herself enjoying. But despite the peace and happiness that enveloped their lives, Lila could not shake the feeling that something was missing. There was a restlessness within her, a yearning for something more, something that she couldn't quite put into words. It was as if a part of her was still searching, still reaching for the fulfillment that had eluded her for so long. It was during one of these quiet moments of introspection that Lila found herself contemplating the idea of motherhood. On Arendor, reproduction had been a controlled, clinical process, devoid of the intimacy and emotion that seemed to characterize human relationships. The thought of bringing new life into the world had never appealed to her. It had always felt like just another way for the elders to exert control over their people. But here on Earth, with Steve by her side, the idea took on a different meaning. It wasn't about fulfilling a societal expectation or adhering to a rigid tradition. It was about love, about the possibility of creating something beautiful and unique, something that was a part of both her and Steve. The thought intrigued her, filled her with a sense of wonder and excitement that she had never known before. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Steve's arm wrapped around her shoulders, Lila turned to him, her violet eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Steve, she began, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking about something important." Steve looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the warmth of the dimly lit room. "But what is it, Lila? You know you can talk to me about anything." Lila hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I've been thinking about having a child. I know it is not something we've really talked about, but I've been wondering what it would be like to try to experience the human reproductive process, to create life together." Steve's expression softened, a look of understanding and love crossing his face. Lila, that is a big decision, and it is something that we should definitely talk about. But if that is something you want, if that is something you feel ready for, then I am with you every step of the way." Lila felt a surge of emotion at his words, a deep sense of gratitude for the way Steve always supported her, always made her feel valued and respected. "I am ready, Steve," Steve said, her voice filled with conviction. "I had spent so much of my life fighting against the idea of being controlled, of being forced into a role I didn't choose. But this would be my choice, our choice. It would be about creating something beautiful together, something that's a part of both of us." Steve smiled, his eyes shining with love. "Then let us do it, Lila. Let's take this step together." Their first kiss was slow, tender, a gentle exploration of the love they shared. Lila felt the warmth of Steve's lips against hers, the steady rhythm of his breath mingling with her own. It was a kiss filled with promise, with the unspoken understanding that this was the beginning of something profound and life-changing. As their kisses deepened, so too did the connection between them. Steve's hands slid down her body, tracing the curves of her figure with a reverence that made Lila's heart ache with love. She responded in kind, her hands exploring the familiar contours of his chest, his shoulders, the strength of his. When they finally moved to the room, it was with a sense of reverence, as if they were embarking on a sacred journey together. They slowly, savoring the anticipation, the knowledge that they were about to create something beautiful and new. Steve's hands were gentle as they moved over her skin, his touch igniting a fire within her that burned with a deep, all-consuming need. Lila had always been in control, always the one who dictated the pace of her relationships. But with Steve, it was different. She trusted him completely, allowing herself to be vulnerable, to surrender to the moment, knowing that he would take care of her, that he would honor the love they shared. When they finally came together, it was as if the world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them, joined in the most intimate way possible. Lila felt a deep connection to Steve in that moment, a sense of unity that transcended the physical, reaching into the very core of who they were. Their movements were slow and deliberate, a dance of love and trust that built steadily toward a crescendo. Lila felt the world tilt beneath her as they moved together, her senses overwhelmed by the intensity of the emotions that flooded through her. It was as if every nerve in her body was alive with sensation, every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of love magnified 1,000-fold. As they reached the peak of their union, Lila felt a rush of warmth and love that seemed to fill her entire being. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, a moment that left her breathless and trembling in Steve's arms. She held onto him tightly, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her own, knowing that they had created something beautiful together, something that would change their lives forever. Afterward, they lay together in the soft glow of the afternoon light, their bodies entwined, their hearts still racing with the aftershocks of their union. Lila felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, a sense of contentment that she had never known before. She turned her head to look at Steve, her violet eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Then thank you, Will," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. The days that followed were filled with anticipation and a deep sense of connection between them. Lila found herself fascinated by the process, by the way her body responded to the idea of creating new life. It was a feeling unlike anything she had ever experienced on Arendor, a sense of purpose and fulfillment that filled her with a quiet joy. One day, After a particularly intimate and loving moment between them, Leela felt a change within herself. It was subtle at first, a small shift in the way she felt, but as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger, more pronounced. Lila began to suspect that something was different, that something extraordinary was happening within her. She decided to take a pregnancy test, a small device that Steve had brought home from the pharmacy. As she stood in the bathroom, holding the test in her hands, Leela's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of hope and fear swirling within her. She followed the instructions carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for the result. And then, there was a small, unmistakable line on the test, indicating that she was pregnant. Lila stared at the test, her heart racing as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She was pregnant. She was going to have a baby. A child that was a part of both her and Steve, a symbol of their love and commitment to one another. For a moment, Leela felt overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. She had never imagined that her life would take this turn, that she would find herself standing in a bathroom on Earth, holding a pregnancy test and contemplating the future as a mother. But as the initial shock began to fade, a new feeling took its place, a feeling of profound joy and excitement. She couldn't wait to tell Steve. When Steve returned home that evening, Lila met him at the door, her heart pounding with anticipation. She led him to the living room, her hands trembling slightly as she took his hands in hers. Steve, began, her voice filled with emotion, "I have some news." Steve looked at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it, Lila? Is everything okay?" Leela took a deep breath, her heart racing as she spoke the words that would change their lives forever. "I'm pregnant, Steve. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Steve just stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. But then, slowly, a smile began to spread across his face, a smile of pure, unbridled joy. He pulled Leela into his arms, holding her close as they both absorbed the magnitude of what was happening. "We're going to have a baby," Steve repeated, his voice filled with wonder. To Lila, "This is incredible." Lila nodded, tears of happiness streaming down her face as she looked up at him. "Yeah, Steve, it is." The news of Leela's pregnancy spread quickly, carried across the galaxy by those who had attended the interspecies conference, by those who had seen the growing connection between Lila and Steve, and by those who were all too eager to see it. By those who were panshin, and by those who were all too eager to share the scandalous news. It wasn't long before it reached Arendor, where it caused an uproar unlike anything the planet had ever seen. The reaction was immediate and intense. The Council of Elders convened in emergency sessions, their discussions filled with anger and fear. For generations, they had controlled every aspect of Arendorian life, maintaining the purity of their species with an iron fist. But now, that control was being threatened by one of their own. Lila's name became a rallying cry for those who had long chafed under the weight of tradition. Across the planet, people began to speak out, questioning the rigid rules that had governed their lives for so long. The younger generation, in particular, saw Leela as a symbol of rebellion, of the possibility of change. They took to the streets in protest, demanding an end to the restrictions that had stifled their creativity, their freedom, their ability to connect with others. For the first time in generations, Arendor was on the brink of revolution. The Council of Elders, desperate to maintain control, issued statements condemning Lila's actions, labeling her a traitor to their species. They called for her capture, for the eradication of the child she carried. But their words only fueled the growing unrest. Across the planet, people began to rise up, their voices growing louder, more insistent. They demanded change, demanded the right to choose their own paths, to love who they wished, to live without the constant oversight of the elders. The protests grew in size and intensity, spreading from city to city, until the entire planet was engulfed in a wave of rebellion. And at the center of it all was Leela. She had not set out to spark a revolution, but her actions, her choices had ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. From her home on Earth, Lila watched as the news reports came in, as the images of the protests, the speeches, the acts of defiance filled the screens. She felt a mix of pride and fear, knowing that she had become a symbol for something much larger than herself. But even as the revolution on Arendor gained momentum, Leela's focus remained on the life growing inside her. She and Steve prepared for the arrival of their child with a mix of excitement and nervousness, knowing that their world was about to change in ways they could never have imagined. When the day finally came, it was as if the entire galaxy held its breath. Leela went into labor in the early hours of the morning, the pain intense but bearable. Steve was by her side the entire time, holding her hand, reassuring her, reminding her of the strength she possessed. The hours passed in a blur of pain and anticipation, until finally, with one last, agonizing push, their child entered the world. The moment was surreal, a culmination of everything Lila had fought for, everything she had dreamed of. The baby girl was placed in her arms, and as Lila looked down at her daughter, she felt a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She was perfect. A beautiful mix of human and Arendorian, with her father those blue eyes and her mother those violet skin. She was a symbol of everything Lila had fought for, a symbol of love, of defiance, of change. As Lila and Steve held their daughter, they knew that their lives would never be the same. They had created something beautiful, something that transcended the boundaries of species and tradition. And as they looked into their daughter's eyes, they knew that they had the power to shape a new future, not just for themselves, but for their people, for the galaxy. In the days that followed, news of the birth spread across Arendor, igniting a final wave of protests that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Council of Elster. The revolution that Lila had sparked reached its climax, as the people of Arendor rose up and demanded the change they had long been denied. The council, faced with overwhelming opposition, had no choice but to step down, relinquishing their power and allowing a new government to take shape, one that respected the rights of individuals, one that embraced diverse diversity, one that allowed for love in all its forms. Lila's rebellion had been successful, but it was more than just a victory for her. It was a victory for her people, for the human she had come to love, and for the future she had helped to create. As she held her daughter in her arms, Lila knew that her journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, but she also knew that she was not alone. She had Steve by her side, she had the love of her people, and she had the strength of the new life she had brought into the world. And as she looked out at the stars, Lila knew that she had finally found her place, her purpose. She had found love, she had found freedom, and she had found a way to change the galaxy. For Lila, the rebellion was over, but the future had only just begun.